So today's lesson is looking at how does life evolve, and this is really where we begin with evolution, and looking at some of the elements that we have found over the years. And usually we look at fossils, and some of the questions that we have is when did life evolve, and how old is the Earth? And that's what I want to help kind of answer today is looking at this idea of life and how it has evolved over the years. So the first slide that I like to look at, well, I'm going to go back to the this one previous, and this slide right here, my introduction is often is referred to as the tree of life. In other words, all these organisms that you can see on something like this is showing you a relationship, almost like that of a tree, where you have at the center here, and down the bottom where the trunk of the tree is, and where I would say is the oldest part of the tree, and where some of the oldest cells are existing on the tree, and then begins to diversify. And as you go up the limbs, and it branches off into different directions, where we have some of the newer variations of living things, including man, lions and tigers and bears. So that's what this is all about, is just showing you the relationship that life has with other forms of life, whether it be lions or tigers or bears. So one of the earliest examples that we can give of this, and we've all seen it, we've gone to the science museums where we've seen fossils, whether they're on the left-hand side here, that of a fish, um, or that of a ancient dinosaur, or even a plant. All of these organisms can be fossilized and have been fossilized. And so when we look at these traces of these dead organisms, we ask the question typically, well, where are they now? And sometimes we can see traces of those organisms' traits in current species, but not necessarily the entire organism from that fossil. So, what have these fossils told us about the history of the Earth? Quite a bit. And it's a great starting point, a great location where we can start. So, if we look at this, like maybe this fossilization of this interpretation, where we have north, south, east, and west on the little area in white, and what we have is a series of footprints. And on the upper side here, on the top by the north section, we have a series of footprints that seem to be spaced out, and then there seems to be a further space between those. Another one that's very similar as far as their shapes are down below here. And then we have a third set of footprints that seems to be moving along here and encounters a smaller version of what we see up on top there. Now, the question typically in the classroom, and I'll have you think about this, is what's happened here? If you're going to look down and see this, what has happened that you can interpret and tell somebody else? You won't necessarily have the full story, but potentially just by your background knowledge and knowing how things work and operate, you could come to some type of conclusion that might be somewhat accurate. And sometimes that's what fossils can do. They can tell us a story. They can tell us about what the Earth used to inhabit and support. And then we look at the modern day Earth and what it supports currently, and whether that is still present. So, one of the things I like to ask is, which way is the wind blowing? And if you're a hunter, or you've hunted before, you know that potentially that the prevailing winds are coming out of the northwest. So if the prevailing winds are coming out of this direction, and blowing this direction, we would say that if you're a predator, this was not likely the wind choice here, even though that's the prevailing winds typically. It seems like if you're a predator, you're going to be your nose and the wind's going to come towards you, especially very sensitive to some of the surroundings. And so in this case, somewhere from maybe the northeast is the prevailing winds in this scenario, because it seems like this predator, a larger footprint, a much different, is moving in this direction and potentially comes across this prey, a smaller version of the prey, and it seems to have dragged it off. Maybe there's an interpretation that you can see from this. So, what I wanted to start off with is maybe something you've seen down the Badlands. Here's a picture of the Badlands in South Dakota, and what you can see is a layering effect, and it's pretty dramatic here in the Badlands of North and South Dakota. You can see on the top surface here is a darker or lighter coloration of gray, and then we have some bands there that are kind of a pinkish, maroon type of color, a larger brand that maroon, and then almost like a darker coal or blackish color that you can see right here, a whitish color. So there are several layers of this. And we would look at this as the top being the newest layers of the Earth, and then the older is further on down. And so this erosion that's taken place has exposed all this for us to see and interpret. If therefore the bottom layers, potentially, if they have any fossils, will have the oldest fossils. This idea is called the law of superposition. And it's a type of, and I put this on the bottom of the screen as relative dating. In other words, it's not very precise. It's relative. It's like, yeah, the stuff on the top is older, and the material on the bottom is much older than that. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And the way the sediment is deposited is through a series of layers, but there's a lot of factors that influence it. One of those factors, of course, is wind and some of the water. And so if you look at A, B, C, and D there, you can see some of the things that have transformed this particular segment over time. And so if I have one, two, three, four, five layers, and then after a period of time, maybe perhaps wind and rain has eroded away some of those layers, you're going to see a different type of pattern. And what's left these areas present is potentially maybe the density and the types of rocks that are present there, much like you would see in South Dakota and North Dakota with those badland areas. And so what you can find, therefore, in letter C is that, again, over time, sediment is deposited, and you can see some of those layerings take effect. Again, if you've ever had a garden, you've probably noticed that if everything is left unchecked, things do get deposited and layered over some of those areas within the garden, or some of those plants, and some of even those stepping stones that you might have. And that's what we're seeing here. So those top layers begin to erode away, and some of that more deposit sediment is deposited on there, where we get this constant layering that you can see within the photo. So knowing this, knowing what is old and what is younger, is complicated by the complexity of erosion and the sedimentation patterns. And so when we say relative dating, it is truly relative in the sense that we're just guessing the age. We know it's older, we just don't know the precise age of that. This is what I'll emphasize again, is called the law of superposition. It gives us no dates, so we don't know how much old or older it is, but it gives us a relative feel for it. Switching to our modern day techniques is a type of tool that we use. We use radioactive isotopes, and we know that on the periodic table, there are several atoms that decay over time. They're radioactive, meaning that their number of neutrons changes as time goes on. And one of the biggest ones that we've given over the years is what is called carbon dating, or carbon. There's a couple different forms of carbon. There's carbon 12 and carbon 14. In a nutshell, carbon 12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, and that adds up to 12. In carbon 14, which is a radioactive isotope, it has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. So 6 plus 8 is 14. That's the atomic mass. And we know that this particular element, carbon 14, exists in the atmosphere at a certain percent. And that's been relatively stable throughout the years of the Earth. There's been some ups and downs, but for the most part, the percentage of carbon 12 to carbon 14 has been relatively stable. So that gives us a time of kind of a geological clock. For example, the table that I have down below has some of those radioactive isotopes. Carbon 14 is one, threonium, potassium, and uranium. And they all have what is sometimes referred to as a half-life. And what a half-life means is that its predictability as far as its decay process. In other words, how long it takes to decay. Carbon 12 doesn't decay. Carbon 14 decays. So if we look at carbon 14, It decays at a rate of around 5,730 years. Half of it will decay into another element. So, knowing that, along with, for example, uranium 238, it has a really what I would call longer half life time period. Um, and so, depending upon what we're looking at, we can measure the amount of radioactive isotopes to give us a more precise time period as far as how old something is. Probably the best way to do that is to give you some examples. Now, again, to summarize that, a half life is the amount of time it takes for half of the isotope, carbon 14, that originally present to decay. So if you start off with 100%, how long till you get to 50% of that radioactive isotope? In the case of carbon 14, it's 5,730 years. So let me give you an example of a woolly mammoth. The last time they were present here was about 10,000 years ago, the last ice age. And if we look at this woolly mammoths and we found maybe a portion of the tusk, not the complete woolly mammoth, but just the tusk, and we wanted to know how old that was, we go down to the Science Museum and we can see down the Science Museum things like this. And usually they have a little date on there, like this organism is X number of years old. Well, the way they have done that to estimate its age is by using radioactive isotopes like carbon 14. So if we notice that this woolly mammoth has 25% of the carbon 14 that compared to current day, um, then we know that it's gone through some half lives. So the idea here is, well, how many half lives has it gone through? It only has 25%. Well, the first time it goes through the half life of 5,730 years would be approximately one half life. A second time it does that, that would be another 5,730 years. That would be about 25%. And we can keep on doing that. So on the table that I have, we're going to assume that we're going to compare the percentage of carbon 14 to the current levels. Current levels be 100%. After 5,000 years, we would expect 50%. In the case of this woolly mammoth, it's got 25%, so it's gone through two half lives. You add both half lives up together, that's 11,460 years. So that's the age approximately. That woolly mammoth's tusk. Another one we could use, let's just use a different example of a radioactive isotope. Um, 3M, 3M, which has got a 230, which has a half life of around 75,000 years. So this Megalosaurus giganticus, was found to have died about 375,000 years ago. So maybe added on to that, since we know the half life, what percentage of the original thorium was found in the remains? So that's just kind of just the opposite of what I just proposed to you. So if we know today it's got 100%, and then the first half life is 50%, which would be around 75,000 years. But we know that it was aged by a scientist to be 375. We got a long ways to go. So if it goes to a second half life, that would be about 150 years old. It's still not enough. So we'd have to go through a third half life, or this organism would. That gives us around 12.5%, or 225,000 years old. Still not to that point. So we go to another half life, 6.25%, because that's half of 12.5. That's 300,000 years old. And then another half life, in other words, about 3.125%, would give us approximate date of what we're looking for. So you can see each time we're doing this, we're comparing to the amount of thorium 230 to what is currently at today in the atmosphere and what's found in present within the remains of whatever we found. So again, another tool at our disposal to determine the approximate time period for this organism and how old it is. Same thing here with using carbon 14. We found some needles that were looked maybe like Native American, estimated to be around 23,000 years old. How much was found in the original? Well, again, if we could use that same logic, 100% today. If we go through 50%, that's 5,730 years. Another 25% is 11,000 years. Half of that would be 12.5%. And again, we'd go through several half lives. In fact, we'd go through 4 half lives. And that total would approximate up to around 23,000 years. So that's what we're looking at as far as using that tool. Now, this isn't a perfect tool. And one of the challenges that is oftentimes criticized is that we don't have all the fossils that show really a good transition. So that's what I wanted just to spend a special note on. And that is, if you look at our current day animals that you can see here, which is you have a killer whale up on top here. And then what I would refer to as these transitional species from its land ancestor. So the land ancestor from these killer whales is on the bottom. And then we see two what I would say is potential fossils that would link some similarities to our current killer whale. And these transitional species are what we would refer to as intermediates. They are these links between what we believe potentially links our modern day species to the past. Now, killer whales happen to be mammals, and we know that mammals have certain characteristics. And so to have some of these features absent and also present brings out a lot of questions. And so we're looking for some of the species that would show the transitions from the bottom here to the top. So unfortunately, not everything is fossilized. Under ideal conditions, sure, but not everything is ideal, especially when it comes to fossilization. And this is something that Darwin was an error of, and that we would predict more if we ever could find them to show some of the transitional species. But these are some of the roadblocks that Darwin and others ran into, not knowing anything about DNA, and also some of the absence of these transitional fossils. So what I have on the far right again is again a tree of life, and if we look at the major kingdoms, major the bacteria, the eukaryotes, those cells that have a nucleus, and the archaea, which is a type of bacteria, we can see some of the similarities and differences and some of the pathways that have taken place. The tree of life, again, is the idea is to show similarities and how we all share commonalities, and also some unique traits that others don't. And whether they're simple unicellular organisms or complex multicellular organisms, this is what this is trying to summarize in this. So, based largely on this radioactive isotopes and dating of these fossils, evolutionary biologists now believe that bacteria were some of the first forms of life on this planet. And they're still here today. And the bacteria on the left here in the blue and the bacteria on the right in red demonstrates some of those possibilities that has existed. And if you move on down to the bottom here, you'll notice that there is at a point where there is some commonalities. And so humans, lions and tigers and bears all have been generated as a result of that. So this is what we look for as far as evolutionary biologists. Now, the questions are, and where it comes from is when did the first cells arise and where did they come from? We're never going to necessarily have the complete answers to that. However, we can make speculations based on evidence like some of the radioactive dating that we can use to support some of our hypotheses and theories when it comes to life on Earth. So some of the things that have certainly changed life and some of the possibilities are some of the things that the events that have occurred. One of the things that we bring out is some of these mass extinctions. We are currently in a very large mass extinctions. We humans are making large impacts as far as what we choose to live based on our fossil fuels and some of the abilities from extinctions from hunting and other elements. But we currently are kind of the culprits of this latest mass extinction. Others that you can think about, some of the fossil record indicates that there have been some brief periods in time in the Earth's history where large numbers have suddenly just disappeared, wiped themselves off the planet Earth. Whether that maybe be a large meteorite, maybe there be fires, maybe volcanoes. All these have disturbed the Earth, and we have evidence of that. And so, whether those asteroids or volcanoes had the effects that we think they might have, that's still, again, being supported by some of the fossils and some of our excavations on some of these areas where we can see some of these impacts. And as I said, some of the human interference is what we're currently influenced or have been influenced by that. So all in all, some of the from the fossil record to how we date things to some of the things that have influenced our ideas as far as what we believe this was all about. And remember, we started off with how does life evolve? So those are things that we're going to explore as we dwell into this, but we have to know where we've come from, and that's kind of where some of those early forms of life have given us that indication.